if you compare images of Akhenaten and other depictions of pharaohs, you'll notice that Akhenaten looks very different.
There is a shelf in the basement of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo where the lighting never quite reaches. Down there, past the tour groups and the gift shop and the long lines for the mummy rooms, sit fragments of a face that Egypt itself tried to forget. Broken noses, shattered cheekbones, statues pulled down from temples on purpose by human hands thousands of years ago and left to rot in rubble until archaeologists dug them back out of the sand. For a long time, nobody could agree on what they were even looking at. Was it a man? A woman? Some kind of ceremonial hybrid meant to represent an idea instead of a person? And then, in a sealed genetics lab in Cairo, a team of scientists ran a DNA analysis that didn't just answer the question. It confirmed something almost too strange to say out loud, and it explains why an entire civilization spent 3 centuries trying to make sure this face was never seen again. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who broke Egypt's gods, rebuilt his own face in stone across an entire city, and left behind a genetic legacy so damaging that within a single generation, the most powerful dynasty on earth had collapsed. To understand why Akhenaten's face mattered so much, you first have to understand what he did with his throne. Around 1353 BCE, Egypt was arguably the most stable and prosperous civilization on the planet. It had run on the same religious system for close to 2,000 years. At the center of that system sat Amun, king of the gods, whose priesthood in the city of Thebes had grown so wealthy and so politically powerful that some historians argue they rivaled the pharaoh himself. Every king before Akhenaten had worked within that system, feeding it, funding it, being crowned by it. Akhenaten set it on fire. Within the first several years of his reign, he ordered the temples of Amun shut down. Their lands were seized. Their priests were stripped of income and standing almost overnight. Festivals that had shaped the rhythm of ordinary Egyptian life for generations simply stopped happening. He didn't stop at Amun, either. He pushed to suppress the old pantheon more broadly, elevating a single divine symbol above all the others, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself. He changed his own name to reflect it, discarding the name his father had given him in favor of one that tied his identity permanently to this one god. Then he did something no pharaoh before him had ever attempted. He abandoned Thebes, the ancient religious capital, and built an entirely new city from nothing, in the middle of the desert, dedicated purely to his new theology. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, and it rose out of the sand in a matter of a few short years. This wasn't a policy adjustment. This was a full theological revolution, imposed from the top down, on a society that had never known anything else. And strange as the religious change was, it wasn't even the part that unsettled people the most. The part that unsettled people was what Akhenaten did to his own image. For 2,000 years, Egyptian kings had been carved a particular way. Broad shoulders, narrow hips, idealized, godlike, ageless. A pharaoh in stone was not supposed to look like a real man. He was supposed to look like a living god, flawless and eternal, because that was the entire point of the artistic tradition. It wasn't decoration. It was theology carved into rock. Akhenaten threw that rulebook out along with the old gods. He commissioned artists to depict him in a way that had never been permitted before, with an elongated, almost egg-shaped skull, a long thin neck, a sunken chest, a swollen belly, wide flaring hips, and thighs that in some reliefs appear almost feminine in their proportions. His face was carved with heavy-lidded eyes, a jutting jaw, and full, elongated lips. His own daughters, painted beside him in family scenes, share many of the same unusual features: thin limbs, soft rounded abdomens, and skulls with a similar stretched quality. Even Nefertiti, his queen, is repeatedly shown with an elongated cranium in her most iconic portraits. Picture what it must have been like to actually stand inside Akhenaten as a visitor. Foreign envoys arriving at the new capital expected the same kind of royal court they'd seen for generations, dignified, symmetrical, carved in the old sacred proportions. Instead, they walked down corridors lined floor to ceiling with a king who looked nothing like any ruler they had ever been presented to. Some diplomatic correspondence from the period, preserved in cuneiform tablets known as the Amarna letters, shows foreign rulers navigating a court whose customs and expectations had shifted in ways that clearly unsettled long-standing diplomatic relationships. Whatever these visitors privately thought of the king's appearance, the art itself was inescapable. It covered temple walls, tomb chapels, and household shrines throughout the city, making Akhenaten's image, whatever it truly represented, the single most repeated human likeness in the ancient world at that time. For nearly a century, Egyptologists argued fiercely about what this meant. Some argued it was purely symbolic, that Akhenaten wanted to be shown as an androgynous figure embodying both the male and female creative principles of the Aten, uniting opposites the way the sun itself was said to nurture all forms of life. Others thought it was simply a new artistic style, sometimes called Amarna art after the modern name for his capital, meant to signal a sharp cultural break from the old order, without necessarily reflecting anything real about the king's physical body. And a smaller but persistent group of researchers wondered if something else entirely was going on, whether the strange proportions in the art might actually be describing a real medical condition, and whether the artist had simply been given permission, for the first time in Egyptian history, to draw the king as he genuinely looked, rather than as tradition demanded he be idealized. That question stayed open for the better part of 100 years, because there was no way to test it. There was no confirmed body. There was only art, argument, and assumption. In 1907, archaeologist Edward Ireton uncovered a small, damaged tomb in the Valley of the Kings that would later be catalogued as KV 55. Inside was a single coffin, badly disturbed, its golden face torn away, its inscriptions deliberately chiseled out by someone in antiquity who clearly wanted this person erased from history. The skeleton inside had an unusually elongated skull and a slender build, and for decades, scholars debated fiercely over whose body it actually was. Some argued it belonged to Akhenaten himself. Others insisted it must be a lesser-known successor named Smenkhkare. The estimated age of death kept shifting depending on which anatomist examined the bones, and without genetic testing, there was simply no way to settle the argument with certainty. Then there was the golden mask found in 1922, arguably the most famous artifact ever pulled from Egyptian soil. The burial mask of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's presumed son and successor. Tutankhamun's mask is nothing like the strange Amarna-style portraiture. It's symmetrical, idealized, and serene, following the older artistic conventions almost perfectly. Which raised an obvious and uncomfortable question. If Akhenaten's unusual features were simply an artistic fashion, why did the very next generation abandon that fashion completely and instantly, reverting to the old idealized style the moment Akhenaten was gone? Why did later pharaohs actively work to erase Akhenaten's name from king lists, chisel his cartouches off monuments, and demolish his city? What were they trying to bury? For most of the 20th century, nobody had the tools to answer that. The debate stayed locked in the world of art history and speculative pathology, doctors and Egyptologists proposing one syndrome after another based purely on how the statues looked, with no way to confirm any of it. Over the decades, the list of proposed diagnoses grew long and often contradictory. Some physicians suggested Marfan syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder that can produce unusually long limbs and a narrow build. Others proposed Froelich syndrome, associated with fat redistribution and delayed development. Still others pointed to gynecomastia, a hormonal condition that can cause breast tissue enlargement in men, as an explanation for the swelling visible on the king's chest in temple reliefs. A few researchers even floated the idea of a hormone-secreting tumor affecting the pituitary gland, which can drive unusual growth patterns over time. Each theory attracted supporters, generated academic papers, and then eventually ran into the same wall. None of them could be tested against an actual, confirmed body, because nobody could say for certain which mummy, if any, belonged to Akhenaten himself. Into the DNA lab. That changed with a major genetic research project led by Egyptologist and former Antiquities chief Zahoras, working alongside geneticist Yehi Agad and a team of international researchers. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the team set out to do something that had never been attempted at this scale on Egyptian royal mummies, extract and sequence ancient DNA well enough to actually map the biological relationships within the royal family of the late 18th dynasty. This was an enormous technical gamble. Ancient DNA is fragile. Egypt's heat is exactly the kind of environment that destroys genetic material over time, and for years, many scientists doubted that usable DNA could survive at all in a 3,300-year-old mummy. The team spent roughly 2 years just designing a study rigorous enough to withstand the scrutiny they knew was coming, building in redundant testing and blind sample verification, so that no single result could be dismissed as contamination or wishful thinking. 11 mummies were eventually selected for testing, chosen because of their probable or suspected connections to the royal family of this era. Among them, Tutankhamun himself, whose identity was already well documented, the mysterious KV-55 individual, whose identity had been argued over for a century, and an unidentified female mummy known only by the working title The Younger Lady, found in a side chamber of a nearby tomb with her face deliberately damaged, seemingly by someone determined that she not be recognized. Researchers worked only with dense bone and tooth samples, where DNA has the best chance of surviving intact, sequencing genetic markers passed down the maternal line, markers passed down the paternal line, and a set of autosomal markers used to calculate kinship probabilities with statistical confidence. Every result was cross-checked under blind conditions before the team would accept it as reliable, and every mummy moved under strict chain-of-custody protocols established by Egypt's National Museum authorities to prevent any question of sample mix-up or contamination. Extractions frequently failed outright. Ancient tissue this fragile does not give up usable genetic material easily, and the team had to repeat many samples multiple times before producing a result they trusted. The methodology and results were eventually published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, opening the findings to scrutiny from geneticists and Egyptologists across the world, which meant the team knew from the outset that sloppy work would not survive contact with the wider scientific community. Here results, when they finally came together, were striking. The genetic data showed that KV-55, the Younger Lady, and Tutankhamun formed a tight biological unit consistent with an immediate family, KV-55 as the father, the Younger Lady as the mother, and Tutankhamun as their son. That alone wasn't shocking. Royal succession through direct bloodlines was exactly what Egyptian dynastic tradition called for. What was shocking came next, when researchers examined the relationship between KV-55 and the Younger Lady themselves. The genetic signatures indicated they were not distant cousins, and not the half-siblings that had already been documented elsewhere in the dynasty. The data pointed to full siblings, sharing both the same mother and the same father. In other words, Tutankhamun, the most famous pharaoh in the modern world, was very likely the product of a brother-sister union. And KV-55, widely believed by many researchers on the project to be Akhenaten himself based on the skeletal features and archaeological context, was potentially both Tutankhamun's father and his uncle at the same time. Once the identity of KV-55 as a strong candidate for Akhenaten was reinforced by the genetic and skeletal data, researchers had something they'd never had before, a confirmed skeleton to build a real facial reconstruction from, rather than relying purely on temple carvings that might or might not reflect reality. Forensic reconstruction from skull morphology is a well-established technique, used everywhere from criminal investigations to historical research, relying on known relationships between bone structure and the layers of soft tissue that sit on top of it. When researchers modeled the skull attributed to KV-55, several features aligned strikingly well with what a Manu-era artist had been carving for years: an elongated cranial shape, a pronounced jawline, and facial proportions that matched the unusual Amana style far more closely than anyone expected if the art had been pure artistic exaggeration. That was the moment the century-old argument tilted. If the artists had simply been inventing a stylized, symbolic image out of thin air, there would be no reason for a real skull excavated from a real tomb to independently match those proportions. Instead, the physical evidence suggested something closer to the opposite conclusion. Akhenaten may have ordered his artists to break from tradition specifically because he wanted them to depict his actual, unusual appearance, rather than force him into the idealized mold every king before him had been squeezed into. The genetic project didn't stop at Akhenaten. It also examined Tutankhamun's own skeleton in extraordinary detail, and what it found reframed the boiking almost entirely. High-resolution CT scans revealed a foot affected by a condition consistent with a clubfoot deformity, along with bone death in areas of the foot caused by a loss of blood supply, a condition that would have made walking without support genuinely difficult. Excavators had actually found more than 100 walking sticks buried in Tutankhamun's tomb, many of them well-worn, as if they had been used daily rather than placed purely as ceremonial or symbolic objects. Scans also revealed a cleft palate, a condition that would have affected his speech and made eating more difficult, along with mild spinal curvature. Genetic testing on tissue samples additionally detected multiple strains of the malaria parasite in his remains, suggesting he had been infected more than once during his life, with at least one active infection at the time of his death. Combined with a body already weakened by inherited skeletal problems, researchers proposed that a combination of congenital illness and infectious disease likely contributed to his death at around 19 years old, a far cry from the vigorous young charioteer often imagined in popular depictions of him. Modern genetics offers a fairly direct explanation for why so much inherited illness clustered inside this single family. When two closely related parents have a child, the probability of that child inheriting two copies of the same harmful recessive gene rises dramatically compared to unrelated parents, since close relatives are far more likely to carry identical versions of the same genes to begin with. Repeated intermarriage across generations compounds that risk further, concentrating rare and often harmful genetic variants until they eventually surface in a child's bones, organs, or immune system. The 18th dynasty had practiced sibling and half-sibling marriage for generations by the time Tutankhamun was born, driven by a deeply held belief that royal blood carried something sacred that could not be diluted by marrying outside the family. That belief, meant to protect the throne, appears to have quietly stacked the genetic odds against every child born into it. None of this fully explains why later generations worked so hard to erase Akhenaten specifically, but the historical record gives some strong clues. His religious revolution had gutted the wealth and influence of Egypt's most powerful priesthood, and once he was gone, that same priesthood had every incentive imaginable to restore the old system and make sure nothing like it happened again. Later king lists conspicuously skip Akhenaten's name altogether, jumping straight from his father to his successors as if his reign had simply never occurred. His city, Akhenaten, was abandoned and later dismantled for building material. Statues of him were smashed, his cartouches chiseled off monuments, his name replaced or omitted in official records. Whether the strangeness of his physical appearance played any direct role in that campaign of erasure is something historians can only speculate about, but it's worth noting that his successors, including his own son, immediately reverted to the old idealized artistic style the moment they took the throne, as though eager to visually distance the dynasty from whatever Akhenaten had represented. Tutankhamun himself, early in his reign, issued a restoration decree reopening the old temples and reinstating the traditional priesthoods his father had gutted, effectively reversing his father's entire religious program while he was still a child on the throne, almost certainly guided by powerful advisors around him. By the time later dynasties compiled their official king lists, Akhenaten, and often Tutankhamun along with him, had been quietly dropped from the record. Their reigns folded into the years of other kings, as though they had never happened at all. A king who had broken every religious rule his ancestors held sacred, and who had insisted on being shown in a form no pharaoh had ever dared display, was not someone the restored priesthood wanted remembered fondly, or perhaps remembered at all. The dynasty's collapse that followed was swift by ancient standards. After Tutankhamun died without a surviving heir, the throne passed first to an aging court official named A, who had no direct royal bloodline, and then to a military commander named Horem, who had none either. The unbroken royal bloodline that stretched back through conquering kings like Thutmose III and celebrated builders like Amenhotep III effectively ended within a single generation of Akhenaten's death, not through invasion, famine, or rebellion, but seemingly through the quiet failure of the family's own biology to keep producing viable heirs. For nearly 3,000 years,